It was upon a damp and cheerless evening in November that the singular case of the woman in black who never blinked first entered our lives, a case so curious in its inception and so chilling in its resolution that I have long hesitated to commit it to paper. Even now, as I set my pen to this account, I find my mind recoiling at certain recollections, though I have stood beside my friend Sherlock Holmes through many a grim and grotesque affair. The fog lay thick upon Baker Street that night, pressing itself against the windowpanes like some sentient presence. The gas lamps beyond glowed dimly, halos of sickly yellow trembling in the murk. Within our sitting room, however, the fire burned steadily, casting a warm and reassuring glow across Holmes's angular features as he reclined in his armchair, long fingers steepled beneath his chin. He had been in one of his more languid moods that day, though I knew well that such stillness often concealed the rapid machinery of his mind. The violin lay untouched upon the settee, and the Persian slipper of tobacco hung limp from the mantel. I, for my part, had been engaged with a medical journal, though I confess my attention wandered frequently toward Holmes, whose silence I had come to recognize as the prelude to either brilliance or boredom. "You observe, Watson," he said suddenly, without turning his head, "that the gentleman who passed below our window at precisely 6:30 suffers from a chronic ailment of the lungs." I looked up, startled. I observed no such gentleman. Holmes allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile. "Naturally not. Your gaze was fixed upon your journal, and your back to the street." Yet the evidence was unmistakable. The labored cough, the irregular footfall, and the telltale pause between breaths. Add to this the dampness of the evening, which exacerbates such conditions, and the conclusion becomes inevitable. I shook my head in admiration. "Your powers never cease to astonish me, Holmes." "They would astonish you less," he replied dryly, "if you employed your own faculties more rigorously." Before I could muster a retort, there came a sharp knock at the door below, urgent, insistent, and altogether out of keeping with the hour. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps followed, brisk and purposeful, and moments later she appeared at the threshold of our sitting room. "A lady to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced, though her expression betrayed a certain unease. She would not give her name, but insists the matter is of the utmost urgency. Holmes rose at once, his languor vanishing like mist before the sun. "Show her up, Mrs. Hudson." The lady who entered was clad entirely in black, a detail which, though not uncommon in London's perpetual mourning, struck me with peculiar force. Her dress was elegant but severe, the fabric absorbing the firelight rather than reflecting it. A veil of fine lace partially obscured her face, though I could discern beneath it a pallor that bordered upon the unnatural. She moved with a measured, almost mechanical grace, and as she took the chair Holmes indicated, I felt an inexplicable chill settle upon me. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," she said, her voice low and steady, "I am told that you are the only man in London who may yet prevent a catastrophe." Holmes inclined his head. "You are very kind, madam. Pray, be seated. This is my colleague, Drive Watson, whose discretion is absolute." She gave no sign that she had heard this introduction. Instead, she fixed her gaze upon Holmes, and it was then that I noticed the most extraordinary feature of all. She did not blink. I do not mean that she blinked rarely, as one might in moments of intense concentration. I mean that her eyes, dark, luminous, and unnervingly still, remained open without the slightest flicker. It was as though they were carved from polished stone rather than living flesh. Holmes, to his credit, betrayed no outward reaction. "You speak of a catastrophe," he said calmly. "Perhaps you would enlighten us as to its nature." The woman leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It has already begun," she said. "2 men are dead, a third has vanished, and I fear that unless you intervene, many more will follow." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "On what grounds do you make this assertion?" "Because," she replied, "I have seen it happen before." There was something in her tone, something cold and final, that caused me to shift uneasily in my chair. Holmes, however, pressed on. "You speak in riddles, madam. If you wish for my assistance, you must be more precise." She hesitated, and for the first time her composure seemed to falter. Her fingers tightened further, knuckles whitening beneath the black gloves. "The first man," she said slowly, "was found in his study 3 nights ago. There was no sign of struggle, no wound, no poison that could be detected. Yet he was quite dead." Holmes nodded. And the second? The second died yesterday morning. Under identical circumstances. And the third? The one who has vanished. A colleague of the other two. He was to meet me this evening. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. He did not come. Holmes crossed to the mantel and took up his pipe, though he did not light it. You have not yet told me your name. There was a pause, long enough that I began to think she would refuse. Miss Eliza Vane, she said at last. Holmes inclined his head once more. Very good, Miss Vane. Now tell me, what connects these three men? She looked directly at him, those unblinking eyes seeming to bore into his very soul. They all saw me. The silence that followed was profound. I felt a curious tightening in my chest, though I could not have said why. Holmes, however, merely raised an eyebrow. I see, he said. And you believe that your presence is, what? Lethal. I do not believe it, she replied. I know it. Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. And yet you come here, to Baker Street, placing both Drive, Watson and myself at risk. If I wished you harm, she said quietly, you would already be dead. I confess that at this point I felt a distinct urge to protest, but Holmes raised a hand, silencing me. Pray continue, he said. Miss Vane drew a slow breath. There is more. Something unnatural. Each of the men reported the same thing before their deaths. And that was, they said that when they looked at me, truly looked, they felt as though time itself had stopped. As though they were caught in a moment that would never end. Holmes's fingers tapped lightly against the bowl of his pipe. Fascinating, he murmured. And you, Miss Vane, what do you experience? For the first time, her gaze shifted. Not downward, nor to the side, but inward, as though she were consulting some hidden chamber of memory. I experience nothing, she said. That is what terrifies me most. A log shifted in the grate, sending a shower of sparks upward. The room seemed suddenly smaller, the air heavier. Holmes turned abruptly and strode to the window, peering out into the fog. Watson, he said, you will oblige me by fetching my coat. I rose at once. You intend to investigate. I intend, said Holmes, to ensure that we are not all victims of a most elaborate, and most dangerous, illusion. He turned back to Miss Vane. You will take us to the scene of the first death. She rose, her movements as precise as ever. I was hoping you would say that. As we descended the stairs and stepped out into the swirling fog, I could not shake the sensation that we were crossing some invisible threshold, that whatever lay ahead would test not only Holmes's formidable intellect, but the very limits of reason itself. And as I walked beside that strange, unblinking woman, I found myself wondering, against all logic and training, whether she spoke the truth. Whether death itself might indeed walk beside us, clad in black, and never once close its eyes. It is a curious fact, which I have observed in my long association with Sherlock Holmes, that the most extraordinary cases often begin not with noise and spectacle, but with stillness. A quiet room, a motionless figure, a detail so subtle that it escapes the notice of all but the most disciplined eye. Such was the case on the night when Miss Eliza Vane led us through the fog-bound streets of London toward the residence of the first deceased gentleman. Our hansom cab rattled along Baker Street and into the broader arteries of the city, the horses' hoofs striking a dull rhythm against the dampened stones. The fog had thickened since our departure, coiling about the wheels and rising in ghostly tendrils past the windows. The driver, hunched in his seat, seemed little more than a silhouette against the dim glow of the street lamps. Within the cab, silence reigned. Miss Vane sat opposite Holmes and myself, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture erect and unwavering. The dim interior light cast shadows across her veiled face, yet her eyes, those unnatural, unblinking eyes, remained fixed upon some indeterminate point ahead. Not once did they flicker. Not once did they shift. I found it increasingly difficult to meet her gaze. Holmes, on the other hand, regarded her with the same cool attentiveness he might afford a rare chemical specimen. His long fingers tapped idly against his knee, though I recognized the gesture as a sign of intense mental activity. At what hour did you last see the first victim alive? He asked at length. Miss Vane did not turn her head. At approximately 9 o'clock in the evening. And he died shortly thereafter. He was found the next morning. But I believe, she paused, as though weighing her words. I believe the moment of his death coincided with our parting. Holmes inclined his head slightly. You believe, Miss Vane, or you know. Her lips pressed together. I have learned to trust my instincts in these matters. Holmes's eyes glinted faintly. Instinct is a most unreliable guide. It is often merely the mind's attempt to impose order upon insufficient data. Then you think me mistaken? She asked. I think, said Holmes, that we have yet to establish any facts at all. The cab slowed, then came to a halt. We have arrived, sir, came the driver's muffled voice. Holmes stepped out first, followed by Miss Vane, and then myself. Before us stood a tall, narrow townhouse of respectable appearance, its facade of dark brick partially obscured by the ever-present fog. A single lamp burned above the door, its light weak and wavering. This is the residence of Mr. Alistair Pembroke, said Miss Vane. Holmes cast a swift glance upward, taking in the windows, the roofline, the condition of the masonry, details which, to my eye, seemed entirely unremarkable. To whom does the house now belong? He asked. To his estate, I believe. The police have sealed the study, but the remainder of the house is unattended. Holmes's lips curved slightly. How obliging of them. Miss Vane produced a key from within her cloak. They allowed me access, she said. I insisted. Holmes accepted the key without comment and turned it in the lock. The door opened with a soft creak, revealing a darkened hallway beyond. Watson, he said quietly, your revolver, if you please. I confess I started at this request. You anticipate danger. I anticipate uncertainty, he replied. And I have always found it prudent to be prepared for the unexpected. I slipped the revolver into my coat pocket, and together we entered the house. The interior bore the unmistakable stamp of a man of means and order. The furnishings were tasteful, the carpets thick, the air faintly scented with polish and tobacco. Yet there was an absence, an intangible quality, which I have often observed in houses where death has recently occurred. A stillness, not the peaceful quiet of an empty room, but a heavier, more oppressive silence, as though the very walls retained some echo of the event. Miss Vane led us down the corridor to a door at the rear. The study, she said. Holmes paused before it, his hand resting lightly upon the handle. Before we enter, he said, I would ask you one question, Miss Vane. She inclined her head. When you last saw Mr. Pembroke, did he remark upon your eyes? For the first time, something like emotion flickered across her face. Yes, she said. He said they made him uncomfortable. Holmes nodded, as though confirming some private hypothesis. Indeed, he opened the door. The study was a well-appointed chamber, lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large writing desk positioned near the window. A fire, long since extinguished, lay cold in the grate. The curtains were half drawn, allowing only the faintest trace of the street lamp's glow to penetrate the gloom. At the center of the room stood a single chair. And in that chair, good God, I whispered. Though I had been informed that the body had been removed, I could not shake the vivid impression that Mr. Pembroke still sat there. The position of the chair, the arrangement of the desk, even the angle at which a book lay open, it all suggested a man who had simply stopped. Holmes moved forward at once, his eyes darting from one detail to another. No signs of struggle, he murmured. No disturbance of the furniture. The ink upon the desk, dry, but recently used. And here, he leaned closer, examining the surface. A letter, I said, peering over his shoulder. Unfinished, Holmes corrected. The paper bore only a few lines, written in a hurried, uneven hand. I cannot explain it, but there is something about her, something wrong. She does not blink, not once. It is as though she. The sentence ended abruptly. Holmes straightened. Most intriguing. He turned to Miss Vane. You see, Watson, he continued, as though she were not present, our victim was sufficiently disturbed to commit his thoughts to paper. This suggests a mind not yet overcome by whatever force ultimately claimed him. Then what did claim him? I asked. Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he crossed to the window and examined the latch, then the sill, then the faint traces of moisture upon the glass. No sign of entry, he said. No poison readily apparent, no mechanical device, and yet the man is dead. He turned back, his gaze sharp. Watson, what do you observe? I hesitated, feeling once again the familiar pressure of his expectations. The room is undisturbed, I said slowly. The victim appears to have been alone. There is no obvious cause of death. Holmes sighed softly. You observe, but you do not see. He gestured toward the chair. Consider the position of the body. But the body is not here, I protested. Precisely. And yet its absence speaks volumes. The chair is angled slightly away from the desk, just so. Why would a man turn from his work unless something, or someone, had drawn his attention? I glanced instinctively toward Miss Vane. She stood at the threshold, exactly where she had been when we entered. Unmoving, unblinking. A chill ran down my spine. Holmes followed my gaze, and for a brief moment, the two of them regarded one another in silence. Then Holmes smiled. A thin, enigmatic curve of the lips. Miss Vane, he said, I wonder if you would indulge me in a small experiment. What kind of experiment? She asked. A simple one. I should like you to sit in that chair. She hesitated. Why? Because, said Holmes, I wish to determine whether Mr. Pembroke died of fear, or of something far more peculiar. The fireless room seemed to grow colder still. Miss Vane stepped forward, and as she lowered herself into the chair, the very chair in which a man had met his inexplicable end, I felt, for the first time in all my years beside Sherlock Holmes, a distinct and unmistakable sense of dread. For though I could not yet grasp the nature of the mystery before us, I knew this much with certainty. We were no longer dealing with an ordinary case. And whatever force lay at its heart, it was watching us. Without ever blinking. If ever I have known a moment in which reason itself seemed to falter beneath the weight of sensation, it was as Miss Eliza Vane seated herself in the late Mr. Pembroke's chair. The act, simple as it was, struck me with a force wholly disproportionate to its nature. It was as though we had, by some unconscious ritual, restored the conditions of a tragedy best left undisturbed. Holmes, however, remained entirely composed. Pray sit exactly as you were when last observed, he instructed, his tone precise. Back straight, hands upon your lap, eyes forward. Miss Vane complied without hesitation. The resemblance, though imperfect, was nevertheless striking. The angle of the chair, the stillness of the figure, the faint glimmer of light upon the eyes, it was all too easy to imagine the unfortunate Pembroke in that very posture, arrested at the threshold between life and death. Holmes circled her slowly, his gaze never wavering. Watson, he said at length, you will place yourself where the deceased would most naturally have stood prior to taking his seat. I obeyed, though not without reluctance, positioning myself near the writing desk. Now, Holmes continued, address Miss Vane as though you were encountering her for the first time. Observe her closely, particularly the eyes. I turned toward her. For a moment, I saw nothing unusual, only a pale woman in mourning, her features composed, her posture rigid. Then I noticed it, the absence. It is difficult to describe, and yet impossible to deny. There was a quality to her gaze, a fixed intensity devoid of the minute, involuntary movements that characterize all living eyes. No flicker, no adjustment, no blink, a most unnatural stillness. I see what you mean, I murmured. Holmes's voice came softly from behind me. Do you, Watson, or do you merely perceive the obvious and mistake it for understanding? Before I could respond, Miss Vane spoke. Is it enough? She asked quietly. Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he stepped forward and, with a suddenness that caused me to start, raised his hand and passed it swiftly before her eyes. She did not flinch. I confess that I did. Holmes lowered his hand, a faint gleam of satisfaction in his expression. Remarkable, he said. Truly remarkable. What does it mean? I demanded. Holmes turned to me, his features once more composed into their usual mask of calm detachment. It means, my dear Watson, that we are confronted with a phenomenon which is either exquisitely artificial, or profoundly pathological. Miss Vane rose from the chair. I assure you, Mr. Holmes, she said, I am neither an illusion nor a patient. Holmes inclined his head. That remains to be determined. We had scarcely concluded this curious experiment when a sound echoed from the hallway, a faint but distinct creak, as of a footstep upon the wooden floorboards. All three of us turned at once. You are not alone in this house? Holmes asked sharply. No, Miss Vane replied. I was assured it would be empty. Holmes moved swiftly to the door and flung it open. The corridor beyond lay in darkness, the faint glow from the study casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. For a moment, All was still. Then, a figure darted past the far end of the hall. "After him!" cried Holmes. He sprang forward with astonishing speed, and I followed close behind, my hand instinctively going to the revolver in my pocket. The floorboards groaned beneath our feet as we raced toward the staircase, where the sound of hurried movement echoed upward. Holmes took the steps two at a time, his long coat flaring behind him. At the landing above, we caught sight of the intruder, a man of slight build, cloaked in dark garments, his face obscured by shadow. He turned briefly, and in that instant I glimpsed something peculiar. Not fear, but urgency. Then he fled. "Stop!" I shouted, though the command was futile. The man vanished down the upper corridor, a door slammed, and by the time we reached it, there was nothing to be seen. Holmes tried the handle. Locked. He stepped back, his eyes narrowing. "Stand aside, Watson." With a sudden, forceful motion, he drove his shoulder against the door. It gave way with a splintering crack. We burst into the room beyond. Empty. A single window stood open, the curtains billowing inward with the cold night air. Holmes crossed to it at once and looked out. "Gone," he said quietly. I joined him, peering into the fog-choked street below, but there was no sign of the fleeing figure. Holmes turned back into the room, his gaze sweeping over the sparse furnishings, a narrow bed, a small table, a wardrobe standing slightly ajar. He moved to the wardrobe and opened it. Inside, hanging neatly upon a wooden peg, was a second black cloak. Identical to that worn by Miss Vane. Holmes regarded it in silence. Then, very slowly, he smiled. "Ah," he said, "now the game is truly afoot." The discovery of the second cloak marked a subtle yet decisive shift in the nature of our investigation. Until that moment, the case had borne the air of something intangible, almost supernatural in its suggestion. Yet here, at last, was an object, solid, ordinary, and undeniably human in implication. Holmes stood for some time before the open wardrobe, his long fingers lightly brushing the sleeve of the black garment. "Identical in cut, texture, and wear," he murmured. "Even the stitching at the cuff, machine-made, though imperfectly aligned. A ready-made piece, likely purchased in quantity." "You mean," I said, "that there is more than one such cloak in existence?" Holmes cast me a fleeting glance. "My dear Watson, I mean that there is more than one wearer of such cloaks, and that our mysterious Miss Vane may not be so singular as she appears." At this, I turned sharply toward the doorway, where Miss Vane had remained throughout our pursuit. She stood just beyond the threshold, her posture as composed as ever, her eyes fixed upon us. "You believe I am not alone," she said. "I believe," Holmes replied calmly, "that appearances, in this case, are being manipulated with considerable skill." Miss Vane stepped into the room, her gaze shifting briefly to the cloak within the wardrobe. "I have never seen that before," she said. Holmes inclined his head slightly. "That, madam, is precisely what I expected you to say." I confess I felt a flicker of irritation at this exchange. "Holmes," I said, "surely you do not suspect Miss Vane of complicity in these crimes?" "She came to us for assistance." Holmes closed the wardrobe and turned to face us both. "My dear Watson," he said, "the most dangerous assumption in any investigation is that the client stands outside the circle of suspicion. It is a luxury we cannot afford." Miss Vane's expression did not change. "If you believe me guilty," she said, "you may say so plainly." Holmes studied her for a moment. "I believe," he said at last, "that you are either the key to this mystery, or its most convincing illusion." We returned to the study shortly thereafter, where Holmes resumed his examination with renewed intensity. The presence of the unknown intruder, and the duplicate cloak, had clearly invigorated him. He moved from object to object with rapid precision, his eyes noting details that escaped my perception entirely. The desk, the carpet, the fireplace, the arrangement of books, nothing was too trivial for his attention. "Watson," he said suddenly, "what do you make of the ink?" I approached the desk once more. "It is dry," I said. "Recently used, as you observed earlier." "Indeed. And yet," he dipped the tip of a pen into the inkwell and held it up to the light. "Observe the viscosity, thicker than one would expect after several hours of exposure." I frowned. "What does that suggest?" "That the ink was disturbed more recently than the writing itself." I stared at him. "You mean someone has been here since the death?" Holmes's lips curved faintly. "Someone has been here," Watson. We have just chased him through the upper floor. He set the pen down. But that is not the most interesting aspect. What is? Holmes gestured toward the unfinished letter. The interruption, he said. It occurs at a point of heightened emotional intensity. The writer is alarmed, perhaps even frightened, yet not incapacitated. Something happens in that instant. Miss Vane enters, I suggested. Holmes shook his head. No, if that were the case, we would expect some physical reaction, a disturbance, a mark, some indication of movement. Instead, we have stillness. His gaze shifted, almost imperceptibly, toward Miss Vane. Tell me, madam, he said, when you last saw Mr. Pembroke, did you remain standing, or were you seated? I remained standing, she replied. Where? Near the door. Holmes nodded slowly, facing him. Yes. And did he look at you? He did. Holmes's eyes gleamed. For how long? Miss Vane hesitated. Only for a fraction of a second, yet it did not escape Holmes's notice. I cannot say exactly, she replied. It felt longer than it should have. Holmes turned away, his expression thoughtful. Time, he murmured. Always time. Our deliberations were interrupted by a firm knock at the front door, so unexpected at that hour that all three of us exchanged a glance. Holmes straightened at once. Remain here, he said to Miss Vane. Watson, with me. We made our way back through the dim corridor to the entrance hall. Holmes opened the door to reveal a broad-shouldered man in the familiar attire of Scotland Yard. Inspector Gregson, I exclaimed. Dr. Watson. Mr. Holmes, said the inspector, stepping inside. His expression was grave. I had a feeling I might find you here. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Then you are ahead of your usual pace, Gregson. To what do we owe the pleasure? Gregson removed his gloves, glancing briefly about the hall. A third incident, he said. Or rather, a development in the existing ones. Holmes's interest sharpened immediately. The missing man. Gregson nodded. Found. Not dead. At least, not yet. But in a state I've never seen before. Holmes's eyes lit with unmistakable excitement. Where? At St. Bartholomew's Hospital. They sent for me, and I came straight here when I heard you were involved. Holmes seized his coat at once. Watson, you will accompany me. Miss Vane. He paused, considering her. You will remain under observation. I will come with you, she said. Holmes regarded her steadily. No, he replied. For the moment, madam, I think it wiser that you do not. For the first time since her arrival, there was a hint, only the faintest trace, of resistance in her expression. But it passed almost instantly. As you wish, she said. Within minutes, we were once more upon the fog-laden streets, bound for the hospital. As our cab sped through the night, I turned to Holmes. What do you suppose we shall find? I asked. Holmes's gaze was fixed upon the darkness beyond the window. A man, he said slowly, who has seen something he cannot comprehend, and has paid the price for that knowledge. And Miss Vane, I pressed. Do you believe her responsible? Holmes did not answer at once. At length, he spoke. I believe, Watson, that we are being led, very carefully, toward a conclusion that is almost certainly false. I felt a chill at his words. Then we are dealing with someone of considerable intelligence. Holmes's lips curved into a thin smile. On the contrary, he said. We are dealing with someone who wishes us to think so. The cab rattled on through the fog, carrying us toward the next piece of a puzzle that was growing ever more intricate, and ever more unsettling. And though I could not yet see the full shape of it, I began to suspect that the truth, when it came, would be far stranger than any of us had imagined. St. Bartholomew's Hospital has ever struck me as a place where the boundary between life and death grows perilously thin. Its long corridors, lined with pale walls and echoing footsteps, possess a solemn gravity that even the most seasoned physician cannot entirely ignore. Yet on that particular night, as Holmes and I followed Inspector Gregson through its dimly lit passageways, I felt a disquiet unlike any I had previously known. There, said Gregson, halting before a closed door. He's inside. Holmes turned to him sharply. Condition. Gregson hesitated. Alive, but you'll see what I mean. Holmes wasted no further time. He pushed the door open and entered, with myself close behind. The room beyond was sparsely furnished, illuminated by a single gas lamp that cast a wan and unsteady light across the bed at its center. Upon that bed lay a man, thin, pale, and utterly motionless. At first glance, I might have taken him for a corpse. But then I saw his eyes. They were open, wide, and fixed upon the ceiling. I stepped forward at once, my medical instincts overcoming my unease. Placing 2 fingers lightly upon his wrist, I felt a pulse, faint, irregular, but undeniably present. "He lives," I said. "Barely," came the quiet voice of a physician from the far side of the room. "We have done what we can, but the case defies all ordinary explanation." Holmes approached the bedside, his keen gaze settling upon the man's face. "No visible injury," he observed. "No sign of poisoning, and yet, complete muscular paralysis." "Precisely," said the physician. "He does not respond to stimulus. We have tested reflexes, nothing. It is as though the body has ceased to obey the will." Holmes leaned closer. "Can he hear us?" "We believe so. There have been slight fluctuations in pulse when spoken to." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Then let us speak plainly." He bent near the man's ear. "Sir," he said in a clear, firm tone, "if you can hear me, I wish you to focus your attention upon my voice. You are safe. You are among those who seek to help you." There was no immediate response. Then, so slight that I might have missed it had I not been watching closely, a tremor passed through the man's eyelids. Holmes's eyes flashed. "Excellent," he murmured. "A mind imprisoned, but not extinguished." Inspector Gregson shifted uneasily. "Can he tell us anything?" "Not directly," Holmes replied. "But there are other means." He straightened and turned to me. "Watson, you will observe closely." From his pocket, Holmes produced a small pocket watch and held it before the man's eyes, allowing the chain to sway gently. "Follow the motion," he said softly. "If you understand me, let your eyes move, however slightly." For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, the pupils shifted, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. Holmes smiled faintly. "There we are. What does it mean?" I asked. "It means," said Holmes, "that whatever has befallen this unfortunate gentleman has not destroyed his faculties, only imprisoned them." He turned once more to the patient. "You saw Miss Eliza Vane," he said. "Is that correct?" The man's eyes remained fixed. Holmes adjusted his approach. "One movement for yes," he said. "None for no." A pause. Then, the faintest flicker. "Yes." A chill passed through me. Holmes continued. "When you looked at her, did you feel anything unusual?" Another flicker. "Yes." "Did you lose consciousness immediately?" "No movement." "No." Holmes's expression sharpened. "Then you remained aware, while your body failed you." A longer pause this time. "Then, yes." I felt my grip tighten upon the bedrail. "Good Lord," I whispered. Holmes, however, pressed on with relentless precision. "Did she touch you?" "No." "Did she speak?" "Yes." "What did she say?" At this, the man's eyes widened, just slightly. But no movement followed. Holmes leaned closer. "You cannot answer in words," he said gently. "But perhaps you can recall the effect." He paused, considering. "Did her words frighten you?" "Yes." "Did they confuse you?" "Yes." Holmes straightened slowly. "Interesting," he murmured. Inspector Gregson stepped forward. "So she is responsible." Holmes raised a hand. "Responsible? Perhaps. But not in the manner you suppose." He turned back to the patient. "One final question," he said. "While you were looking at her, did you notice anything change?" The room seemed to hold its breath. For several seconds, there was nothing. Then, the man's eyes shifted upward, as though straining against some invisible barrier. And in that moment, I saw it. Terror. Raw, unfiltered terror. Then, yes. Holmes exhaled softly. "That will suffice." He stepped back, his expression once more composed. "Well, Watson," he said, "we have now a third variation upon our theme." "A variation," I repeated. "Indeed. The first man dies. The second follows. The third," he gestured toward the bed, "is suspended in a state between the two." I felt a growing unease. What could cause such a thing? Holmes slipped the watch back into his pocket. "Not what, my dear Watson," he said quietly. "But how?" Inspector Gregson frowned. "You're losing me, Holmes." Holmes turned toward the door. "Come, gentlemen, there is little more we can learn here tonight." As we stepped out into the corridor once more, I could not resist one final glance back at the motionless figure upon the bed. His eyes remained open, unblinking, fixed upon nothing, and for the first time since this case had begun, a dreadful thought took root in my mind. What if Miss Eliza Vane was not the cause of these horrors, but merely the instrument of something far more insidious? Holmes said nothing as we left the hospital, but I could see by the set of his jaw that his mind was racing ahead, connecting threads that I could not yet perceive. The game, as he had said, was indeed afoot, but the board upon which it was played was growing darker with every move. It was well past midnight when we emerged once more into the fog-laden streets, yet neither Holmes nor I showed any inclination toward rest. The revelations at the hospital had cast a long and unsettling shadow over the case, and I could see by the keen light in Holmes's eyes that his mind was far from at ease. We rode in silence for some distance before I could restrain myself no longer. "Holmes," I said, "you cannot seriously entertain the notion that this is anything but some obscure medical condition, perhaps a rare paralysis of nervous origin?" Holmes gave a soft, almost indulgent chuckle. "My dear Watson, when a phenomenon presents itself thrice under differing conditions, death, repetition, and suspended animation, we must look beyond the ordinary classifications of medicine." "But the symptoms are precisely what we are meant to focus upon," he interrupted. "And that, I suspect, is the very trap being laid before us." I frowned. "Then you believe this is deliberate?" Holmes turned his gaze toward me, his expression sharp. "I believe, Watson, that we are dealing with an intelligence that understands not only human perception, but its limitations." Upon our return to Baker Street, we found Miss Vane precisely where we had left her. She stood near the window, her figure framed against the dim glow of the street lamp beyond. The curtain stirred faintly beside her, yet she herself remained utterly still. Unnaturally so. Holmes entered without greeting and removed his gloves with deliberate care. "You have not moved," he observed. "No," she replied. "Nor have you slept." "I do not sleep easily." Holmes regarded her intently. "Yes," he said quietly. "I can well imagine." I stepped forward. "We have seen the third man." For the first time, her attention shifted, fully, directly, toward me. "And," she asked. "He lives," I said. "But he cannot move. He cannot speak. Only his eyes respond." A faint tightening passed across her features. "Then it has worsened," she murmured. Holmes's head tilted slightly. "Worsened. That is an interesting choice of words." Miss Vane clasped her hands more tightly. "The first two died quickly," she said. "This is something different." Holmes moved closer, his voice soft but precise. "You anticipated this progression, did you not?" She did not answer. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "You have seen it before," he continued. "You said as much, yet you have not told us where, or when." A long silence followed. At last, she spoke. "It was not in London," she said. "It began elsewhere. Months ago." "Where?" Holmes pressed. Her lips parted, then closed again. "I cannot say." Holmes's expression hardened. "You will say, madam, if you expect my assistance." She met his gaze, unblinking, unwavering. "If I tell you," she said quietly, "you may refuse the case." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "I have never refused a problem of sufficient interest. This one may cost you more than interest." Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Miss Vane, the only thing I value above my own safety is the truth. And I assure you, I am already far too intrigued to withdraw." She studied him for a moment, as though weighing something of great consequence. Then, slowly, she spoke. "It began in Vienna." The name seemed to hang in the air, heavy with implication. Holmes turned away at once, crossing to the mantel where he lit his pipe with measured calm. Yet I knew him well enough to recognize the significance of this revelation. "Vienna," he repeated softly. "A city not unfamiliar with experimentation." I felt a stir of unease. "What sort of experimentation?" I asked. Holmes exhaled a thin stream of smoke. "The mind, Watson. Always the mind." He turned back to Miss Vane. "You were there. In what capacity?" She hesitated. "Then, I was a subject." The word struck me with unexpected force. "A subject," I repeated. "You mean?" "Yes," she said. "I was part of a study. A series of trials conducted by a man who believed he could alter perception itself." Holmes's eyes lit with sudden intensity. "Ah," he said. Now we approach something tangible. What sort of trials? I asked. Miss Vane's voice grew quieter. He claimed that time, as we experience it, is not fixed, that it can be stretched, compressed, even halted within the human mind. I felt a chill creep along my spine. That is madness, I said. Holmes shook his head. On the contrary, Watson. It is theoretically sound, though practically dangerous in the extreme. He stepped closer to her. And this man, what was his name? Miss Vane hesitated. For the first time since her arrival, I saw something unmistakable in her expression. Fear. Dr. Matthias Rovin, she said at last. Holmes's reaction was immediate. Rovin, he repeated. But that is impossible. You know him? I asked. Holmes's face had grown very still. I know of him, he said. A brilliant neurologist, dismissed from every reputable institution in Europe for his unorthodox methods. And dangerous ones, Miss Vane added. Holmes nodded slowly. Yes, dangerous indeed. He turned away, pacing the length of the room. And what became of this drive? Rovin. Miss Vane's voice dropped to a whisper. He disappeared. Holmes stopped. Disappeared. Yes, shortly after the final experiment. And you? Holmes asked. What happened to you? She raised her eyes to his. I was the last subject, she said. A heavy silence fell upon the room. Holmes regarded her with renewed intensity. And ever since, he said slowly, those who look upon you, suffer these effects. Yes, Holmes's mind was clearly racing now. Not immediately, he murmured. Not always fatally, but progressively, consistently. He turned sharply. Watson, do you see it? I see only that this grows more incomprehensible by the moment, I admitted. Holmes's lips curved faintly. Then allow me to clarify. He stepped closer, his voice low and precise. We are not dealing with poison, nor with disease. He paused. We are dealing with an idea. I stared at him. An idea, yes, said Holmes. One so powerful, so precisely constructed, that it can alter the very functioning of the human mind. He gestured toward Miss Vane. She is not the cause, Watson. Then what is she? I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed in the firelight. She is the carrier. The word sent a chill through me. A carrier? Of what? Holmes's smile faded. Of a perception, he said quietly. One that, once seen, cannot be unseen. Miss Vane spoke again, her voice barely audible. He called it the stillness. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the fog pressed ever closer against the windows. And in that moment, I realized with growing dread that we stood upon the brink of something far more terrible than any ordinary crime. For how does one fight an enemy that exists not in the body, but in the mind itself? Holmes said nothing further that night. But long after the fire had burned low and the city had fallen silent, I lay awake, unable to banish a single, haunting thought. What if the danger was not in seeing Miss Vane, but in understanding what one had seen? And if that were so, how long before we, too, became prisoners of that terrible stillness? I have often remarked that Sherlock Holmes possessed the singular ability to remain untouched by those influences which would unnerve a lesser mind. Where others felt fear, he found curiosity. Where others recoiled, he advanced. Yet on the morning following Miss Vane's confession, I observed in him something altogether rarer. Not fear, nor even doubt, but a profound and deliberate caution. It was shortly after dawn. The fog had lifted somewhat, though a pale haze still lingered over the city. Holmes had not slept. I knew this not merely by his wakefulness, but by the subtle signs which years of companionship had taught me to recognize, the sharpened gaze, the restless pacing, the untouched breakfast tray. Miss Vane remained with us still. She had taken a seat near the window, where she now sat as she always did, perfectly composed, perfectly still. If she felt the strain of her revelations, she gave no outward sign of it. Yet I could not rid myself of the sensation that her presence altered the very atmosphere of the room, as though something unseen had entered with her and refused to depart. Holmes stood before the fireplace, his back to us, his hands clasped behind him. At what interval did the effects manifest in Vienna? He asked suddenly. Miss Vane did not move. It varied, she said. Sometimes hours, sometimes days, never immediate. Holmes nodded slightly. And always preceded by direct visual engagement. Yes. Eye contact. Yes. Holmes turned then, his expression keen. And this drive, Rovin, did he observe the same effect in himself? A pause. No, she replied. He claimed immunity. Holmes's lips thinned. Convenient. I shifted uneasily. You believe he is responsible for what is happening here? I asked. Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he crossed to the table and picked up a sheet of paper upon which he had been making notes. I believe, he said at last, that we are dealing with a man who sought to weaponize perception itself, and may well have succeeded. Weaponize, I repeated. Yes, Watson. Consider it. Not a toxin, not a blade, not even a mechanical device, but an experience. Something that, once introduced into the mind, begins to act upon it, subtly at first, then with increasing severity. I felt a chill, but how could such a thing be transmitted? Holmes's gaze shifted toward Miss Vane. That, he said quietly, is the question upon which everything hinges. It was at this juncture that Holmes proposed a course of action which, I confess, filled me with no small degree of apprehension. We must retrace the path, he said, from victim to victim, establish the chain of contact, and identify the point at which this idea is being introduced. Inspector Gregson, who had joined us once more that morning, frowned. You think someone's going around spreading this? He said. Holmes inclined his head. I think it exceedingly likely. Then why haven't there been more cases? Holmes's eyes glinted. Because, my dear inspector, the method is not yet perfected, or the experiment not yet complete. Miss Vane spoke quietly. He would not release it widely, she said. Not until he was certain. Holmes turned to her. Certain of what? That it works. Our first step was to revisit the second victim, a Mr. Edwin Halberd, whose residence lay in Bloomsbury. Unlike Pembroke's house, this one was not abandoned. A constable stood guard at the entrance, and we were admitted only after some negotiation on Gregson's part. The interior bore the same oppressive stillness I had noted before, though here it was accompanied by something else, a faint disarray, as though the occupant had not succumbed quite so peacefully. Holmes moved at once to the sitting room, where the body had been found. Here, said Gregson, indicating a spot near the hearth. Collapsed where he stood, Holmes knelt, examining the carpet. Not seated this time, he murmured. Interesting. He rose and surveyed the room. Was Miss Vane present here as well? He asked. Gregson nodded. So she says. Holmes turned to her. And did you stand near the door again? No, she replied. He approached me. Holmes's expression sharpened. Ah. He paced slowly, reconstructing the scene in his mind. A man approaches, engages, observes closely. He stopped abruptly. Watson, what do you notice about this room? I looked about. The furniture is slightly disturbed, I said. The chair is out of place. The rug is creased. Holmes nodded. Precisely. Unlike Pembroke, Halberd moved, reacted, before the effect took hold. What does that suggest? I asked. That the stimulus was stronger, or delivered more directly. He turned again to Miss Vane. Did he comment upon your eyes? Yes. And did you respond? I told him not to look at them. Holmes's eyes flashed. Too late, I imagine. She said nothing. We had just concluded this examination when a constable entered hurriedly. Inspector, he said, there's been another report. Gregson stiffened. Another? Yes, sir. A gentleman taken ill in his carriage not half an hour ago. Same symptoms, they say, unable to move, staring fixed. Holmes was already reaching for his coat. Location, Russell Square. Holmes turned to us, his energy suddenly electric. You see, Watson, he said, the pattern accelerates. We hastened from the house and into the street, where a cab was quickly procured. As we drove, Holmes leaned forward, his eyes alight with fierce concentration. This is no longer a contained series of incidents, he said. It is spreading. But how? I asked. Holmes's gaze was distant. Not randomly, he said. Never randomly. There is intention here, design. Miss Vane, seated opposite us, spoke in a low voice. He is testing it. Holmes looked at her sharply. Yes, he said, I believe he is. When we reached Russell Square, a small crowd had already gathered around a halted carriage. A uniformed officer was attempting to disperse them, but curiosity had taken firm hold. Holmes pushed through at once, and I followed close. Behind. Inside the carriage sat a man of middle age, his body rigid, his head tilted slightly to one side. And his eyes, open, unblinking, fixed upon the opposite seat. Holmes stepped up and peered inside. Who was with him? He demanded. The officer shook his head. No one, sir. Driver says he was alone. Holmes's expression darkened. Alone? He repeated. Miss Vane had come to stand beside us. I have never seen him before, she said. Holmes turned slowly. No, he said. I do not believe you have. A heavy silence fell. Then how? I began. Holmes raised a hand. Consider, Watson, if the effect requires only that the subject perceive the stimulus. His voice trailed off. Then, very softly, then the source need not be present at all. I felt a sudden and profound unease. You mean? Holmes's eyes lifted, scanning the square, the windows, the passers-by, the countless unseen vantage points. I mean, he said quietly, that we may be looking in entirely the wrong direction. Miss Vane spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. He has improved it. Holmes did not look at her. Yes, he said, I believe he has. As we stood there amidst the murmuring crowd and the creeping dread of yet another victim, I felt the ground shift beneath my understanding of the case. No longer were we dealing with a single woman, or even a single perpetrator. We were confronting something far more elusive. Something that could reach its victims without touch, without proximity, perhaps even without presence. And as Holmes's gaze swept the square with relentless intensity, I realized that for the first time since I had known him, even he did not yet see the full shape of the enemy we faced. But I had no doubt of one thing. When he did, the truth would be as terrifying as it was inevitable. If there is one quality in Sherlock Holmes which I have come to regard with equal parts admiration and unease, it is his willingness, nay, his eagerness, to place himself in the path of danger when the pursuit of truth demands it. By the time we returned to Baker Street from Russell Square, I could see that he had already formed the outline of a plan, and from the peculiar brightness in his eyes, I knew it was one he would not easily be dissuaded from pursuing. You cannot be serious, Holmes, I said, as he began at once to rearrange the contents of our sitting room table, clearing away papers, adjusting the lamps, and drawing the curtains with deliberate care. My dear Watson, he replied, I have seldom been more so. Miss Vane stood near the hearth, her stillness as unnerving as ever, though I fancied there was now a trace of apprehension beneath her composure. You intend to use me, she said. Holmes paused, regarding her with that keen, measuring gaze of his. I intend, he said, to observe the phenomenon under controlled conditions. If you are indeed the carrier of this stillness, then we must determine precisely how it is transmitted, and whether it may be interrupted. And the risk, I interjected sharply. You have seen what it does, Holmes. Death. Or worse, you cannot propose to expose yourself deliberately. Holmes's expression softened, though only slightly. My dear fellow, I would hardly be worthy of the name if I shrank from an experiment merely because it carried a degree of personal inconvenience. Inconvenience, I cried. You speak of it as though it were a mild fever. The man at the hospital remains alive, Holmes cut in calmly. Which, I assure you, is a most significant detail. He turned back to Miss Vane. You will assist me, madam. She hesitated, but only briefly. If it will end this, she said, then yes. Holmes inclined his head. Excellent. The preparations, though simple in appearance, were executed with Holmes's usual precision. He positioned a chair at the center of the room, much as we had seen in Pembroke's study, and arranged the lamps such that Miss Vane's face would be clearly illuminated, while the surrounding space remained in relative shadow. Light, he remarked, is as much a participant in perception as the eye itself. He then produced from his chemical cabinet a pair of lightly tinted lenses, which he affixed within a simple frame. A precaution, he explained, handing them to me. You will wear these, Watson. And you? I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. I shall rely upon my own faculties. I was on the verge of protest, but his expression warned me that it would be futile. Now, he said, taking his position opposite Miss Vane, we shall proceed. She seated herself, her hands once again folded neatly in her lap, her gaze directed forward. Unblinking, Holmes sat across from her, leaning slightly forward, his eyes fixed upon hers. Begin, he said softly. At first, there was nothing. The room was silent save for the faint crackle of the fire and the distant rumble of carriage wheels in the street below. Holmes's face remained composed, his gaze steady and unwavering. I stood to one side, watching intently, my heart beating somewhat faster than I cared to admit. Seconds passed. Then, I noticed a change. It was subtle, so subtle that I might have dismissed it had I not been so acutely alert. Holmes's posture stiffened, ever so slightly. His fingers, resting upon the arms of the chair, ceased their habitual movements. "Holmes," I said quietly. He did not respond. A chill crept along my spine. Miss Vane remained perfectly still. Her eyes, those terrible, motionless eyes, remained fixed upon his. "Holmes," I said more sharply. At that instant, he raised one hand, slowly, deliberately. "Do not interrupt," he said, his voice controlled, though strained. I fell silent at once. His gaze did not waver. "What do you perceive?" I asked, forcing myself to remain calm. There was a pause. Then, "Distortion," he said, "not of sight, but of sequence." I frowned. "Sequence. Time," he said quietly. "Or rather, the perception of it." His breathing had grown slower. Measured. "Watson," he continued, "observe the flame." I turned toward the fire. For a moment, I saw nothing unusual. Then, good God, the flame seemed to hesitate. Not flicker, not dance, but pause, as though caught between one movement and the next. I blinked hard. The effect vanished. "It is an illusion," I said quickly. "It must be." "No," said Holmes softly. "It is a reordering." His voice had grown distant. Moments, stretched, separated. His hand tightened upon the chair. And between them, he did not finish. A sudden, violent tremor passed through his body. "Holmes," I cried. He gasped. Once, sharply, and then slumped forward, his eyes closing at last. Miss Vane rose at once. "I warned you," she said, her voice low but urgent. I rushed to Holmes's side, supporting him as he sagged in the chair. "Holmes, can you hear me?" For a moment, there was no response. Then his eyelids fluttered, and he drew a long, steady breath. "I am quite well," he said faintly. "You are nothing of the sort," I exclaimed. "You have just subjected yourself to the most illuminating experience of my career," he finished, opening his eyes. To my immense relief, they blinked. Repeatedly. Naturally. He sat upright slowly, passing a hand across his brow. "Remarkable," he murmured. "Truly remarkable." Miss Vane regarded him intently. "You felt it," she said. "Yes," Holmes replied, "though not as our unfortunate victims have." "Why not?" I asked. Holmes turned to me, and there was a strange light in his eyes, a mixture of triumph and something perilously close to awe. "Because, my dear Watson," he said, "I did not accept it." I stared at him. "Accept it? Accept what?" Holmes rose to his feet, his energy returning with startling rapidity. "The premise," he said. "The underlying suggestion upon which the entire effect depends." He began to pace, his mind clearly racing ahead. "It is not merely what one sees," he continued, "but what one believes one sees. The mind, once persuaded that time itself has faltered, begins to behave accordingly, slowing, freezing, collapsing inward." Miss Vane spoke quietly. "He told us that resistance was futile." Holmes stopped. "Yes," he said, "and therein lies his genius." I felt a growing unease. "You mean, this drive, Rovin has created a kind of mental contagion?" Holmes nodded. "Precisely. An idea so potent that it overrides the natural functions of the brain." He turned sharply. "And now, he has found a way to transmit it without direct presence." "The carriage," I said suddenly. "The man in Russell Square, he was alone." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Not alone, Watson, merely unaware of the presence." A silence fell. Then, "You know how he does it," I said. Holmes smiled. A thin, dangerous smile. "I know where to look." He reached for his coat. "Come, Watson, we have dallied long enough." "Where are we going?" I asked. Holmes paused at the door. "To find a man," he said, "who believes he has made himself invisible, by hiding within the very fabric of perception itself." Miss Vane stepped forward. "And when you find him?" Holmes's gaze hardened. "Then, madam," he said quietly, We shall see whether even the most brilliant illusion can withstand the scrutiny of reason. As we stepped once more into the fog-bound streets, I could not shake the lingering image of the fire's hesitant flame, the impossible pause between one moment and the next. Holmes walked beside me with renewed purpose, his stride swift, his mind clearly fixed upon some destination yet unknown to me. And though his confidence was as formidable as ever, I could not help but wonder. What if this was not merely a battle of intellect, but one in which the very act of perceiving the enemy brought one closer to defeat? For if Holmes was correct, if the danger lay not in the eye, but in the mind, then how could even he be certain that he had not already begun to see what was never meant to be seen? It has long been my belief that there are moments in a man's life when disparate threads, long scattered and seemingly unrelated, suddenly converge into a single, undeniable truth. Such a moment, I am convinced, had come upon Sherlock Holmes as we hurried through the thinning fog of that November morning. His pace was brisk, almost urgent, and though I pressed him repeatedly for an explanation, he offered none. Instead, he moved with that singular focus which I had come to recognize as the prelude to revelation. "Holmes," I said at last, as we turned into a narrower street lined with tall, soot-darkened buildings, "you must tell me what you have deduced." He did not slow. "I have deduced," he replied, "that we have been looking at the effect, and not the mechanism. And now you see both." "I see enough." We halted at last before a modest but respectable building bearing a discreet brass plate beside the door. R. Kessler, Optical Instruments and Scientific Apparatus. I read the inscription aloud. An optician. Holmes's lips curved faintly. A most convenient profession for a man who wishes to manipulate perception. He rang the bell without hesitation. The door was opened by a thin, elderly gentleman whose sharp features and keen eyes spoke of long habit in observation. He regarded us with mild curiosity. "Yes, gentlemen, Mr. Kessler, I presume," said Holmes. "I am he." Holmes inclined his head. "Sherlock Holmes. This is my colleague, Drive. Watson. We should be obliged if you would permit us a few moments of your time." At the mention of Holmes's name, the man's expression altered, very slightly, yet perceptibly. "I have heard of you," he said. "Pray, enter." The interior of the shop was cluttered but orderly, its shelves lined with lenses, instruments, and curious devices whose purposes I could scarcely guess. A faint scent of metal and oil hung in the air. Holmes wasted no time. "You have recently supplied optical equipment to a Drive. Matthias Rovin," he said. Kessler stiffened. "I do not discuss my clients." Holmes stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "Then allow me to be more precise. You constructed for him a series of lenses, custom-made, highly specialized, and designed to alter not merely vision, but perception." A long silence followed. Kessler's fingers tightened upon the edge of the counter. "I do not know what you are implying," he said carefully. Holmes reached into his pocket and withdrew the tinted lenses he had used in our experiment. "Then perhaps you will explain this," he said. Kessler's eyes flickered toward them, and in that instant, I saw it. Recognition. Holmes saw it too. "Ah," he said softly. "So you do know." Kessler exhaled slowly, as though some internal resistance had given way. "You should not involve yourselves in this matter," he said. "It goes beyond your comprehension." Holmes finished coolly. "I assure you, sir, that my comprehension is precisely why I am here." Kessler hesitated, then gestured toward a door at the rear. "Very well," he said. "But what I tell you, you did not hear from me." The room beyond was smaller, more private, a workshop of sorts, littered with tools and half-finished devices. Upon a central table lay a curious apparatus consisting of a frame fitted with multiple lenses, arranged at precise angles. Holmes approached it at once. "Rovin's work," he said. Kessler nodded reluctantly. "He came to me months ago," he said. "Spoke of theories, of the brain's interpretation of visual stimuli, of temporal perception. At first, I took him for a visionary, perhaps even a genius. And later, I asked." Kessler's expression darkened. "Later, I realized he was quite mad." Holmes examined the apparatus closely. "These lenses," he said, "they are not intended for ordinary use." "No," said Kessler. "They are designed to create a specific visual effect, a pattern of light and motion that, when perceived, induces a disruption." "In the sense of time," Holmes said. "Yes." I felt a chill. You mean this device can cause what we have seen? Kessler shook his head. Not directly. It is not the device itself, but what it shows. A sequence. A pattern so precisely calibrated that the brain cannot reconcile it. Holmes straightened. A contradiction, he said. One that forces the mind to abandon its normal processing. Kessler nodded. And in that moment, everything stops. I felt a growing dread as the implications became clear. But the victims, I said. They were not wearing such devices. No, said Holmes quietly. But they did not need to. He turned to Kessler. You adapted the design, did you not? Reduced it, refined it, until it could be conveyed through something far simpler. Kessler hesitated. Yes, he admitted, at his insistence. How? I demanded. Kessler swallowed. The eyes, he said. A heavy silence fell. Holmes's gaze sharpened. He trained a subject, he said slowly, to reproduce the pattern, not mechanically, but biologically. Kessler nodded. Through conditioning, repetition, exposure, until the subject's gaze itself became the medium. Miss Vane. The realization struck me with force. Good God, I whispered. Holmes's voice remained calm, but there was a steely edge beneath it. And once established, he said, the pattern need only be seen once to take hold. Yes, said Kessler, though the strength varies. Holmes began to pace. And the man in Russell Square? I said. He saw no one. Holmes stopped. Not no one, Watson, he said. Nothing recognizable. He turned to Kessler. You found a way to project the pattern, indirectly. Kessler shook his head. I did not. He did. How? Holmes pressed. Kessler's voice dropped. Reflections. Glass. Surfaces. Any medium capable of conveying the image. I felt my pulse quicken. You mean, a window? A mirror? Anything, Kessler said. Once the pattern is embedded, it can be transmitted in fragments, and the mind completes the rest. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Brilliant, he murmured. Terrible, but brilliant. And where is he now? Holmes demanded. Kessler hesitated, then gestured toward a ledger upon the table. He returned 3 days ago, he said. Requested additional components. I refused him. Holmes seized the ledger and scanned it rapidly. An address, he said. In Whitechapel. He turned at once toward the door. Come, Watson. I followed, my mind reeling. Holmes, I said, if what Kessler says is true, then anyone could be exposed at any moment. A passing glance, a reflection. Precisely, Holmes said, which is why we must end this now. As we stepped back into the street, the city seemed altered, no longer merely fog-bound, but filled with unseen dangers lurking in every pane of glass, every polished surface. Holmes, I said, lowering my voice, what of Miss Vane? Holmes did not slow. She is no longer the primary vector, he said. Merely the prototype. A cold weight settled in my chest. Then there may be others. Holmes's expression was grim. If Roven has succeeded fully, he said, then we may already be too late. We turned into Whitechapel, where the streets grew narrower, the buildings more dilapidated, and the air thick with the mingled scents of industry and decay. Holmes halted before a derelict structure, its windows dark, its door hanging slightly ajar. This is it, he said. I placed a hand upon my revolver. Shall we proceed? Holmes glanced at me, and for the first time since this case began, I saw in his eyes not uncertainty, but resolve of the most absolute kind. Yes, he said quietly. We shall proceed. And as we crossed the threshold into that shadowed building, I could not shake the dreadful certainty that we were about to confront not merely a man, but the architect of a horror that, once unleashed, might never again be contained. For what defense can there be against an enemy that resides not in the world, but in the very act of seeing it? It is no exaggeration to say that, of all the places into which I have followed Sherlock Holmes, none has impressed itself upon my memory with such immediate and oppressive force as that derelict house in Whitechapel. There was, from the very threshold, a sensation not merely of decay, but of abandonment by something more essential than its former occupants, as though the building itself had been emptied of vitality, leaving behind only a husk. Holmes entered without hesitation. Close the door, Watson, he said quietly. I did so, though not without a lingering glance at the street beyond, where the gray light of morning seemed infinitely preferable to the dim interior before us. The hallway was narrow and choked with dust. Our footsteps stirred faint clouds that hung unnaturally long in the air. A single shaft of light fell through a broken pane above, illuminating the motes in a way that I found unsettling. Holmes paused, his head slightly inclined. "Do you notice it?" he asked. "The dust?" I said. "No. The movement." I frowned. At first, I perceived nothing unusual. Then, gradually, it became apparent. The particles did not drift as one would expect. Their descent was irregular, hesitant. Some seemed to linger, suspended, before continuing their fall. A trick of the light, I told myself. "And yet, Holmes," I said slowly, "this place has been prepared," he finished. Carefully, he moved forward, his steps measured. "Keep your eyes lowered when possible," he added, "and avoid direct focus upon reflective surfaces." I obeyed at once, though the very act of doing so heightened my awareness of the surroundings in a most uncomfortable fashion. We passed through 2 adjoining rooms, each more desolate than the last, until at length we came upon a door at the far end of a narrow passage. It stood slightly ajar. Holmes raised a hand, signaling me to halt. "Listen," he whispered. I strained my ears. At first, there was nothing. Then, a sound so faint that I might have dismissed it altogether. A rhythmic ticking, slow, deliberate. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "A metronome," he murmured. "Or something very like it." "Why?" I asked. "To regulate perception," he said. "To guide the mind toward a particular expectation." He pushed the door open. The room beyond was unlike any I had ever seen. Its walls were lined, not with furniture or decoration, but with glass. Mirrors, panes, polished surfaces of every conceivable shape and size. Some were clear, others faintly tinted, still others warped in subtle ways that distorted the reflections they cast. At the center of the room stood a simple table. Upon it rested a small mechanical device, the source, I presumed, of the steady ticking sound. And beside it, a man. He stood with his back to us, his posture erect, his hands clasped loosely behind him. "Dr. Matthias Rovin," said Holmes calmly. The man did not turn at once. "So," he said, his voice smooth and composed, "the great Sherlock Holmes arrives at last." There was no surprise in his tone, no alarm, only satisfaction. "That," he said, "is what we must determine." He took a chair opposite her. "Look at me," he said. She did. Those same unblinking eyes. Yet now, I fancied, there was a trace of something human within them. Holmes met her gaze steadily. Seconds passed. Then, she blinked. Once, twice. I started. "Holmes, did you see?" "Yes," he said quietly. Miss Vane raised a hand to her face, as though startled by her own action. I have not done that in months," she whispered. Holmes's expression softened, if only slightly. "The conditioning is breaking," he said. "Freed from its reinforcement, the mind reasserts its natural functions." Tears, real, unmistakable tears, gathered in her eyes. "Then it is over," she said. Holmes inclined his head. "Yes," he said, "it is over. And yet, as I sit now and record these events, I cannot entirely dismiss a lingering thought. For though the mechanism has been exposed, the perpetrator apprehended, and the victims, where possible, restored, there remains the memory, the knowledge, the idea, and as Holmes himself once remarked to me, in a moment of rare candor, the most dangerous thing in the world, Watson, is not a weapon, but a thought. Whether that thought has truly been extinguished, or merely lies dormant, awaiting some future mind to rediscover it, is a question I leave to the judgment of those who come after us. For my own part, I can only say this. I have looked upon a woman who did not blink, and for a brief and terrible moment, I understood why. It is with no small sense of relief that I set down the closing particulars of this singular affair, though I would be remiss, in my duties as both physician and chronicler, were I to omit those final observations which lend the case its fullest, and, perhaps, most troubling, significance. In the days following our last interview with Miss Eliza Vane, her condition continued to improve in a manner both gradual and remarkable. The rigidity which had once defined her posture softened, the unnatural stillness of her gaze gave way, little by little, to the ordinary motions of the human eye. Each blink, so trivial a gesture in most, seemed, in her case, an act of quiet triumph. Yet recovery, as I have often observed, is seldom without complication. Holmes, though outwardly satisfied with the resolution of the matter, maintained a careful watch upon her progress. He insisted that she remain in London for a time, under our observation, and it was during this period that certain subtler effects began to reveal themselves. "You will notice, Watson," he said one afternoon, as we sat together while Miss Vane rested in the adjoining room, "that while the primary conditioning has been broken, residual impressions may persist." "In what form?" I asked. Holmes tapped lightly upon the arm of his chair. "Moments of hesitation," he said. "Brief distortions in perception. The mind, having once been persuaded of a false structure, does not relinquish it entirely without resistance." I considered this. "You mean she may still experience the stillness?" "Not in its full expression," he replied, "but in echoes." It was not long before I witnessed such an echo for myself. Miss Vane had been seated by the window, engaged in the simple act of observing the street below, a pastime which, for her, had acquired an almost meditative quality. I was speaking to her, of inconsequential matters, I confess, when, quite suddenly, she fell silent. Her gaze fixed, her expression altered, not to the previous rigidity, but to something more subtle. A pause, a fraction of a second, perhaps. Then, she blinked, and the moment passed. "Miss Vane," I said. She turned to me at once. "Yes, doctor, you seemed distracted." She frowned slightly. "For an instant," she said slowly, "I thought the carriage below had stopped moving." I glanced out the window. It had not. I reported the incident to Holmes at once. "As I expected," he said. "A residual misalignment between perception and reality. Harmless, provided it is recognized as such." "And if it is not?" I asked. Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. "Then," he said, "the mind may attempt once more to impose the false structure." Dr. Matthias Rovin, meanwhile, was held under the strictest supervision, his case having attracted considerable attention among both the medical and legal communities. I was permitted, on one occasion, to accompany Holmes to the facility in which he was confined, a visit which, though brief, proved most illuminating. We found him much as we had left him, composed, self-assured, and utterly unrepentant. "You have stopped nothing," he said to Holmes as we entered. "You have merely delayed the inevitable." Holmes regarded him coolly. "On the contrary," he said, "I have demonstrated that your inevitable is contingent upon belief, and belief may be challenged." Rovin smiled. "Can it? Tell me, Mr. Holmes, have you not, even now, questioned the flow of time? Have you not felt it hesitate?" I saw, in that instant, a flicker, so slight that another might have missed it, pass through Holmes's eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it came. "I have felt many things," Holmes said calmly, "none of which I mistake for reality." Rovin's smile widened. "Reality," he repeated softly. "Such a fragile concept." It was some weeks later that Miss Vane came to take her leave of us. The fog had lifted from London, replaced by a crisp, clear morning that lent the city an almost unfamiliar brightness. She stood in our sitting room, no longer clad entirely in black, but in a simpler attire that seemed to reflect her altered state. "I owe you my life," she said. Holmes shook his head. "You owe me nothing," he replied. "You have merely been restored to yourself." She turned to me then. "And you, drive, Watson. Your kindness has not gone unnoticed." I bowed slightly, though I confess I felt a certain awkwardness in accepting her gratitude. "What will you do now?" I asked. She paused. "I think," she said, "I shall learn to live in time again." Holmes's lips curved faintly. "A most worthwhile endeavor." She moved toward the door, then hesitated. "There is one thing," she said, turning back. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Yes." She met his gaze, steadily, but now with unmistakable humanity. "For a moment," she said, "when you looked at me that first night, did you feel it?" Holmes regarded her in silence. Then, "Yes," he said simply. She nodded. "I thought so." And with that, she departed. In the quiet that followed, I found myself reflecting upon all that had transpired, the strange deaths, the imprisoned mind, the terrible ingenuity of Rovin's design. Holmes, as was his habit, seemed already to have set the matter aside. He had taken up his violin once more, and as the notes filled the room, I sensed that for him, the case had reached its natural conclusion. And yet, Holmes, I said, do you truly believe it is finished? He did not cease his playing. Finished, he repeated. No case is ever truly finished, Watson. It merely reaches a point at which further inquiry yields diminishing returns. I considered this, and the idea, I pressed. The stillness. Holmes lowered the violin at last. My dear fellow, he said, ideas do not vanish. They persist, quietly, patiently, until such time as they are rediscovered. He met my gaze. But so too does reason. It is in that spirit that I close this account. Whether the discoveries of Dr. Matthias Rovin will one day resurface, I cannot say. Whether some future mind, unburdened by the lessons we have learned, may attempt once more to tamper with the delicate machinery of perception, this, too, remains uncertain. But I know this. I have seen a man trapped within a single moment. I have seen time itself appear to falter. And I have seen a woman, once the unwilling vessel of a most terrible idea, learn, at last, to blink. If there is a moral to be drawn from these events, it is perhaps this: that the human mind, for all its vulnerabilities, possesses a resilience no less remarkable. And that even in the face of the most insidious illusion, there remains, always, the possibility of waking. You expected me, Holmes said. Rovin gave a soft chuckle. My dear sir, I have been waiting for you. He turned then. I confess that I had anticipated something grotesque, something visibly unhinged. Instead, I beheld a man of refined appearance, tall, well-dressed, his features sharp and intelligent. His eyes, however, they held a peculiar intensity, not unblinking, like Miss Vane's, but focused, as though he saw more than was there. You have caused a great deal of distress in this city, Holmes said. Rovin inclined his head slightly. Progress often does. 3 men are dead or dying. 3 men, Rovin corrected gently, have contributed to a most significant advancement in human understanding. My temper, I confess, rose at this. Understanding, I exclaimed. You speak of murder as though it were a laboratory exercise. Rovin's gaze flicked toward me, briefly, dismissively. Ah, he said, Dr. Watson, I presume. The chronicler. Holmes stepped slightly forward. You will cease your experiments, he said. Rovin smiled. On the contrary, he replied, I have only just begun. Holmes's gaze swept the room, taking in the arrangement of mirrors, the device upon the table, the subtle interplay of light and reflection. You have refined the transmission, he said. Removed the need for a direct subject. Rovin's smile widened. Not removed, expanded. He gestured lightly around him. Do you see, Mr. Holmes? The mind is not a passive receiver of reality, it is its architect. Alter the input, and you alter the structure. And in so doing, Holmes said coldly, you destroy it. Rovin shook his head. No, I reveal its limitations. He stepped closer to the table, adjusting the small device with a practiced hand. The ticking grew slightly louder. Time, he continued, is not a constant. It is a perception, constructed, interpreted, maintained. Break that perception, and what remains? Chaos, I said. Freedom, he replied. Holmes's voice remained steady. And Miss Vane, he asked, what role does she play in your philosophy? Rovin's expression softened, almost fondly. My first success, he said. The proof that it could be done. You used her, I said sharply. I elevated her, he corrected. She carries within her the key to a new understanding of existence. Holmes's eyes hardened. She carries a weapon, he said. One you intend to distribute. Rovin spread his hands. Why limit such a discovery? Imagine a world in which time itself may be shaped at will, where suffering may be stretched into insignificance, or moments of joy prolonged indefinitely. And the cost? Holmes demanded. Rovin's smile did not falter. Every advancement has its cost. Holmes took a slow step forward. You have overlooked one detail, he said. Rovin raised an eyebrow. And what is that? Holmes's gaze was unwavering. The human mind does not yield so easily as you suppose. Rovin chuckled. My dear Holmes, you have already experienced the effect, have you not? And yet here you stand, curious, engaged. Yes, Holmes said quietly. Because I recognized it for what it was. Rovin's eyes gleamed. Did you? Holmes nodded. A suggestion, he said. A carefully constructed illusion, dependent not upon the eye, but upon belief. Rowan tilted his head. Then you understand its power. I understand its weakness, Holmes replied. A silence fell. Rowan's smile faded, just slightly. And what weakness is that? Holmes's voice was calm. It requires acceptance. In that moment, something shifted in the room. I cannot say precisely what, only that the air itself seemed to grow taut, as though an invisible tension had been drawn to its limit. Rowan's gaze sharpened. You believe you can resist it, he said. Holmes did not answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and withdrew the tinted lenses he had shown earlier. You see, Doctor, he said, I have no intention of perceiving your creation as you intend it. Rowan's expression darkened. You cannot avoid it, he said. It is everywhere in this room. Holmes smiled faintly. Then it is nowhere in particular, he replied. He turned to me. Watson, close your eyes. What? I exclaimed. Do it. Trusting him utterly, I obeyed. The ticking of the device seemed louder now, insistent, intrusive. Now, said Holmes, his voice steady, listen only to my voice. Not the ticking, not the silence between, only the sound of reason. I focused as best I could. Rowan's entire construct, Holmes continued, depends upon the mind seeking order, seeking to reconcile what it perceives. Deny it that reconciliation, and the structure collapses. Rowan's voice cut in, sharp now. You are mistaken. Am I? Holmes said quietly. There was a sudden movement, a crash of glass as something struck one of the mirrored panels. Watson. Now, I opened my eyes. Holmes had seized the central device and hurled it to the ground, where it lay shattered. The ticking ceased. Instantly, the room seemed to release. The oppressive tension vanished. The strange hesitation in movement, the subtle distortions, were gone. Rowan staggered slightly, his composure cracking at last. No, he said. No, you cannot. Holmes advanced, his gaze relentless. It is over, he said. Rowan's eyes darted about the room, at the mirrors, the broken device, the shifting reflections that now held no power. You do not understand, he said desperately. I was on the verge of destroying minds, Holmes said coldly. Nothing more. Inspector Gregson's voice sounded from the doorway behind us. Then it's a good thing we arrived when we did. He stepped into the room, constables at his back. Rowan did not resist. As he was led away, I could not help but glance once more at the shattered fragments upon the floor, the remnants of a device that had, for a brief and terrible time, threatened to alter the very fabric of perception. Holmes stood beside me, his expression once more composed. Well, Watson, he said, what do you make of our adversary? I considered for a moment. A brilliant man, I said slowly. And a dangerous one. Holmes nodded. Yes, he said, though not, I think, quite so invincible as he believed. And yet, as we left that dreadful house behind us, I could not entirely shake a lingering unease. For though the device was destroyed, and the man apprehended, the idea remained, and ideas, once seen, have a way of lingering, even in the most disciplined of minds. It would be a grave error, I think, to suppose that with the apprehension of Dr. Matthias Rowan, the matter was at once concluded. On the contrary, if anything, the days which followed served only to deepen the peculiar unease which had taken root in my mind. For while the architect of the horror had been removed, one could not so easily dismiss the question of what, precisely, he had left behind. Holmes, for his part, exhibited none of the outward triumph which might have been expected. There was no indulgence in self-congratulation, no languid return to his violin or chemical amusements. Instead, he remained in a state of quiet vigilance, his thoughts, I knew, still circling the problem like a hawk above its prey. It is not finished, Watson, he said to me on the morning following Rowan's arrest. We sat once more in our familiar sitting room at Baker Street. The fire burned low, and the light filtering through the window bore that pale, uncertain quality peculiar to late autumn. Not finished, I repeated, but the man is in custody. His apparatus destroyed. Holmes steepled his fingers. Yes, he said, and yet the effect, however induced, has already been observed in multiple subjects. We must ask ourselves, does it cease merely because its originator has been removed? I considered this uneasily. You think it may persist? I think, said Holmes, that we must verify whether it persists. It was for this reason that we returned once more to St. Bartholomew's Hospital. The unfortunate gentleman whom we had examined, the third victim, remained in much the same condition as before, alive, yet imprisoned within his own body, his eyes the only sign of continued consciousness. The attending physician greeted us with a grave expression. "There has been no improvement," he said, "nor any decline. It is as though he exists in a fixed state." Holmes nodded. "Precisely what we must investigate." He approached the bedside once more, his manner calm but intent. "Sir," he said, leaning slightly forward, "if you can hear me, I ask that you attend closely." The man's eyes shifted, faintly, but unmistakably. Holmes drew a chair close and seated himself. "Watson," he said, "you will observe the pupils." I did so at once. Holmes continued, his voice steady and deliberate. "You have been subjected to a powerful suggestion, one which has disrupted your perception of time. But the source of that suggestion has now been removed." He paused. "There is no longer any external reinforcement." The man's eyes remained fixed. Holmes leaned closer still. "Therefore," he said, "the only thing sustaining this condition is your own belief in it." A long silence followed. I confess that I felt a certain skepticism at Holmes's approach. The idea that such a profound physical state could be reversed by mere reasoning seemed, at best, optimistic. "And yet, consider," Holmes went on, "that time continues. That your body remains capable. That your mind is not bound, unless you choose to accept the illusion that it is." The man's pupils contracted slightly. "Good," Holmes murmured. "You perceive the inconsistency." Another pause. "Now, reject it." For several seconds, nothing occurred. Then, a tremor. It passed through the man's hand, so slight that I might have missed it had I not been watching with the utmost attention. I caught my breath. "Holmes, silence," he said sharply. The tremor came again, stronger this time. The man's fingers twitched. Then, with a sudden, almost violent motion, his hand jerked upward. The attending physician gasped. "Incredible." Holmes's voice remained calm, though there was a note of quiet triumph beneath it. "Yes," he said, "quite." The man's breathing quickened. His eyes, which had been fixed and lifeless, now darted, wild, uncertain, but undeniably alive. "You are free," Holmes said firmly. "Do you understand?" The man's lips parted. A faint, hoarse sound emerged. "Yes." The effect upon those present was profound. The physician could scarcely contain his astonishment, while I myself stood in silent admiration of Holmes's extraordinary insight. "You have done it," I said. "You have reversed the condition entirely." Holmes rose, adjusting his cuffs with characteristic composure. "Not entirely," he said. "The mind, once disturbed, does not always return at once to perfect equilibrium. But the principal mechanism has been dismantled." He turned to me. "You see, Watson, the so-called stillness is not a physical paralysis, it is a cognitive one. Break the illusion, and the body follows." I nodded slowly. "And the others?" I asked. "The two who died." Holmes's expression grew more somber. "They were not afforded the opportunity," he said quietly, "or lacked the capacity to resist. Our next concern, naturally, was Miss Eliza Vane. We found her where we had left her, at Baker Street, seated near the window, her posture unchanged, her gaze as steady as ever. Yet there was something different now. Something diminished. "You have returned," she said. Holmes inclined his head. "The matter is concluded." She regarded him intently. "Is it?" Holmes stepped closer. "Dr. Roven is in custody. His apparatus destroyed. The effect he cultivated has been identified, and countered." A faint shadow passed across her face. "And what of me?" she asked. Holmes was silent for a moment. "You are no longer necessary to his design," he said at last. Her hands tightened slightly. "But the effect, does it remain?" Holmes studied her closely.